All right, so we're going to get started. And again, happy Friday out there for everybody. Thank you for pivoting with us. We normally do our training webinars on Tuesday, but we pivoted to Friday. So thank you again for following along with us and excited to be here with you. And again, I am Sean, and we are going to be going over today's training session on the workflow basics. So we'll be going over how workflows within Flux get all the things grant making from point A to point B, and point C and D and E, depending on your workflow. So as we always do, if you should have any questions at any time during the session, make sure you jot those down in the questions sections, and we'll save the last few minutes to address these. But if you have a question, don't necessarily wait until the end. Feel free to enter them at any time. But we'll go ahead and get started. So today's agenda, we're going to go over rolling with your profile, and to learn more about roles and profiles, moving to a new state, so you can see how to add new states and categories to your existing workflows, smooth transition by adding the buttons that take you from one state to another, roles and your workflows. So we'll learn how roles relate to your workflows. And then digitizing your business process. Essentially, how to build a workflow in Flux. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll be addressing all of your questions at the end of the overview. So today's webinar, we're going to take a simple workflow like the one that you see on your screen and translate it into Flux, so that you too can take workflow diagrams of your business processes and create them in Flux. Or simply make changes to your existing workflow to accommodate changes to your existing business process and configuration. So don't worry, we're going to revisit this diagram a little bit later. So first, let's start by talking about roles and profiles. So roles and profiles, all users need one of each. But what are they, and what's the difference between the two? So first, let's talk about profiles. Profiles are generally universal across all Flux clients. The standard profiles you'll see are employee, grantee, reviewer, board or trustee, auditor, and consultant. As a general rule, profiles should not be modified. Please leverage these standard options within Flux. A user's profile determines what they can see within the system. Each user is presented with a dashboard when they log in, such as the grantee portal, the reviewer portal, or the internal staff dashboard. This is tied to the profile along with other permissions. You'll want to make sure that your users have at least one profile assigned so they can see what they need to do. I'm sure most of you know that you can have multiple profiles assigned, but it is required at least one. Roles, on the other hand, determine what a user can do in your system, like who can take action, such as edit, update, or move a record in an individual workflow. So we'll be leveraging roles later on in this presentation, as they are what have direct correlation to the workflow. Roles are unique from client to client, but some example roles that you might recognize are grantee, grants manager, program officer, program director, finance, president. Those are some common ones. Roles can be assigned by program area so that the ability to change records are limited to a user's particular program area. For instance, if a person is assigned the role of a program officer in program A, they cannot edit or update a card in the program B, even if the role of program officer is authorized in the workflow itself. Most often, users are assigned to all programs, so they're not limited to actioning requests in a certain program area. Lastly, it's important to note that both profiles and roles are assigned by admin or super users in your systems. So we're going to take a brief departure from roles, but we're going to come back to them in a little bit. Now let's talk about workflows, which are effectively the digitized business process for your organization. Specifically, we'll be looking at workflow states and types. One thing to keep in mind is that workflows are unique to each organization and each theme within Flux. Remember, what we call a theme in Flux is what you may think of as a form. For example, let's say our foundation has an education program and an animals program. Applicants for the education program fill out a completely different form from the applicants in the animals program. These two forms would be our two different themes in Flux. And each theme, education and animals, also have their own separate workflows. Even if our foundation's business process is the same for both programs, we would still have two workflows, one for each theme, which would be configured identically. So if we change the business process, we would need to make changes to both workflows to ensure they remain the same. Now let's dig in deeper to understand what we mean by workflow states. As we mentioned, a workflow is your digitized business process. A workflow state is a point in your business process where the record needs to have some action taken on it. If we think back to what used to happen to a paper grant application, we can think of states as the different people that the application was given to. For example, the first applicant fills out the application, then it's given to the grants manager to make sure it's completed. Then it's handed to a program staff to review and approve, and so on and so forth. Those people correlate to each of the states that we would want to configure in Flux. Part of setting up workflow states in Flux is assigning them a state type. So workflow state types are universal system required labels that are applied to your workflow states, so the system knows where your record is in the process. Because each organization's business process is different and states are unique to each Flux client, the system needs to know whether the state is at the beginning of the workflow, in the middle, or at the end. So, for example, when you start a new request, the system knows at what state the request should begin. Using the new state type determines this for the system. That's what we have annotated on the right section of the screen there. While you can build workflows unique to each theme, workflow states are universal and available across all themes for purpose of system consistency. You will likely already have many of the workflow states you need in your system. At very minimum, a new draft state and a granted state. Leveraging the same states across your different themes can be helpful for your users as well when it comes to filtering and organizing cards. You may not use all the states for every theme, but they are available for all themes whether you use them or not. As a best practice, you will want to consolidate and leverage the same states as much as possible. And as a reminder, because workflow states are universal across the model, Be careful about deleting workflow states, as they will be deleted for all your themes. So let's have a little practice. Here's the sample workflow that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. Depictions of workflows come in many forms: Excel, flowcharts, narrative, and so on. Our implementation team sees many variations of workflows when we initially translate clients' needs into Flux. So let's figure out the workflow states in this particular scenario. We have swim lanes for each person in our workflow, and the arrows show where the request can go. So, what should the first workflow state be? Yep, you got it. It's draft. So next, we see the box for ready for submission. Now, does this need to be a separate workflow state? No, because applicants can save and return to requests as needed. We don't need to create a separate state. So when we can just call this the new state for both draft and ready for submission in Flux. Now let's step through the rest of the workflow. Once an applicant submits, it goes for intake review by the grants manager, who can either send it back to the applicant for revisions or send it on to the program officer for review. If the program officer approves the application, it goes to pending promotion before it's granted. Now, for pending promotion, do we need a state here? That's a trick question. Maybe. It depends on your business process. Perhaps the program officer has already generated the grant agreement letter and sent it to the grantee. Or maybe this is the point where the grants manager would do it. We often find that pending promotion state can be a helpful holding point for requests that need to have a grant agreement generated and sent. Once you've determined all the workflow states you'll need for a record's journey through the approval process, you'll need to determine the buttons that your users will actually use to move the record from one state to another. Workflow buttons are the actionable buttons that your users actually press to move a record from one state to another. The workflow buttons are unique to each theme and workflow. You can create as many workflow buttons per state as you need, which in some cases may only be one, and others it may be multiple buttons. These workflow buttons are labeled individually and permissioned individually, which we'll get into in a little bit. So, returning back to our sample workflow, we can generate the buttons that are needed to ensure our request gets from new to granted. First, for our new state, our applicant will need to be able to submit their application. Then, on the intake review, we have two options. The request can go back to the applicant for revisions or be sent to the program officer for review. If the request goes back to the applicant, they will need the ability to resubmit. Or if the request goes to the program officer, they'll need the ability to approve. But perhaps they'll need to send it back to the intake review. Or send it back to the applicant. Once it's been approved by the program officer, then the request can be promoted to a grant. We've almost made the Flux logo out of our arrows. Kind of cool. And finally, let's bring back what we learned about roles to help our users in the workflow. Now that we know what our workflow buttons are, we need to confirm who can actually use them. This is where the roles that we previously talked about come into play. Workflow buttons are permissioned by role, with the exception of admin users, who will always see all the workflow buttons. It is important to remember that giving a role permission to a workflow button also gives them access to edit the record. So returning back to our workflow, we can use the swim lanes to determine who the allowed roles are in this particular example. The grantee should be selected on the Submit button and on the New State, and the Resubmit button on the Send Back to Applicant state. The Grants Manager should be selected for all the buttons on the Intake Review and Pending Promotion states. And the Program Officer should be selected for all the workflow buttons on the Program Officer Review state. But let's say the Program Officer should also be able to promote to a grant. So we'll want to select the Program Officer on the Promote to Grant button as well. All right. Now, we can work through creating a workflow together. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with how to access it, but as a reminder, you can enter the admin panel in our Avant dashboard, which I hope the majority, if not all of you, are using. You'll want to open up the left-hand menu and navigate to the bottom left of your screen to the Settings and Themes button and click Admin. Once you've entered the admin panel, the first step is to make sure that we're in the workflow on the left-hand side of the menu. Then, make sure that you're in a grant request model type. And we'll be working in the grant request theme that I've created for this webinar. It's called Base Template Grant. Make sure that you've clicked into your practice theme as well, if you're doing this with us. So now we're going to be able to see the navigation in here in the main panel, and we can get started. So as a recap, the steps that you'll want to take: access your workflow, access the model type, access the theme. From here, we're going to add a new state to our workflow. And we see our existing workflow here in the admin panel. The states are the bars with a state name and the system name in parentheses. Again, these are universal for all of our grant request themes. The small rectangles are existing workflow buttons on this particular theme, Base Template Grant. So first, we'll want to click the New State button on the bottom of the page. Next, in the Attributes tab, we'll want to give the state a new name. When you first create a workflow, the internal name you give to the workflow button will become the system name. Notice that the name in parentheses for your other states, you'll want to keep these short and sweet. In this case, we'll just call it Intake Review. You can change the state name visible to users later if need be, but not the system name. You'll also want to enter the external description, which is what your applicants or grantees will see. We'll use Under Review. Next, since this is simply an additional state in the workflow, we won't select a category, and we'll just choose Workflow for the state type. Lastly, we can ignore the allowed roles on the workflow state. Allowed roles should never be added to a workflow state, only on a workflow button. You can also ignore the other options below, which are more advanced workflow configurations. So once you have your workflow set up, you have to make sure that you click Save. Otherwise, all your work was for naught. And that's it. You just created a new workflow state. So here's the order that we need to go through. You're going to create a new state by selecting the button on the bottom. You're going to give it an internal name. Choose, if need be, an external description. Select the state type, and then save your work. So now that we have a new workflow state, we'll want to add a workflow button to it. First, we'll want to find the workflow state on which we'll be adding a button. The intake review state we created. So start with that and then click on the little plus on that particular state. Right there. Next, in the Attributes tab, you'll want to give your button a name. So let's say Intake Review Complete. Next, you'll see the state from which your workflow is transitioning from, which is the state you are currently creating your button for. But you'll want to select the state in which the record should move to or move in the To state dropdown. You can choose the next state in your workflow. Lastly, here's where you'll want to select your allowed roles. With this example, I'm going to select the program director and program officer, but you can pick the role that you think is best from your list. And of course, save your work. Well, you can ignore the suppress validation and guard instructions options when creating a workflow button, as this is more for the advanced workflow options. So recap, here's the order that we'll need to do. You start with adding a button to the state by the plus button there. Give that button a name. Choose the state that it's coming from and then moving to. And assign who or the allowed roles that have access to it. And save your work. A pro tip, when you're building or changing a workflow in Flux, it's best and very important to test out that workflow to ensure that the users have the proper permissions and states are labeled. So use pre-prod or pre-production as your testing ground. So you'd hate to make a change and then it affects your end users in the middle of their flow. All right, so that is going to wrap it up for the overview portion of today's webinar. So we're going to take a look at the Q&A and see what we have here. All right, let's see here. We have a question here. What do categories mean or do in the profile attributes section? That's a great question we can provide clarity to. These are hard-coded things and have pieces of functionality attached and should directly correlate to the profile you give the user. All right. Let's see what else we have here. We have a question here. Let's see, I may have missed this, but are you supposed to put the allowed role on the button and not the state itself? That again, I'm glad you asked because we're happy to go over this as much as possible because it is really important. Always, always, always put the allowed role on the button and not the state. It will take a developer work to remove that allowed role from the state itself. So it's not a quick, easy fix to like, whoops, I saved it. Nope, I can't delete. Oh, support ticket. Oh, got to create a dev task ticket to get that removed. So, great question. Let's see here. We have another one. I have some employees who all have the same profile and role. However, some of them are unable to see the workflow buttons that most other program leads have. Why is that? That's a great question. I mean, there could be a number of things causing this, but it sounds like there's an issue probably with the program roles. Now, all of your program leads can have the program lead role, and program role can be allowed on the button itself. However, take a look at the program that is on that specific grant record. That program may not roll up to all programs. And depending on how your program roles are set up, your employee might not have rights to that specific program. So if you have it set to all programs for that user, but on that request itself, the particular program isn't rolling up to the parent program of all programs, they're not going to have access to what they need to. So you can either change that user to that specific program if that's the best solution for you, or make sure that you roll that particular program up to the parent program of all programs. And that should get you where you need to be. All right, let's see what else do we have here. Why do you need to have a new category on a workflow state? That is another great question. And we're going to actually get into this quite a bit in our next workflow webinar. But workflow categories dictate a number of things in Flux. A quick example would be if you use the LOI feature, or registration as some people refer to it, you can promote an LOI into a request. The system is going to look for the new category to create the request in. All right, great questions. Okay. Just as a follow-up, actually, we're focusing a lot on workflows because it's a key element of the Flux environment. Today's training webinar was on the basics of the workflow. Next Monday, we're going to have the Ask a Fluxpert session webinar for around workflows in general. So if you have some specific questions, that's a great opportunity to join and really try to stump our Fluxperts. And then the following Tuesday, the week after next Monday, we are going to get into the secondary training webinar that's going to be more on the advanced aspects of workflows. So hopefully we got a chance to answer everybody's questions, but again, as I mentioned, we got a couple upcoming webinars that would allow for any additional questions if you need. And of course, we're always here in support and happy to answer your questions. So today, to conclude everything, we went over rolling with your profile. Yes, we made up that word. Moving to a new state, smooth transitions, roles and your workflows, and then, of course, digitizing your business process. If you want to share this with anybody else or reference it in the future, you can always access our knowledge base at flux.zendesk.com. You'll have access to all our past training webinars, as well as a list of our upcoming ones, links to register for future webinars, and of course the suggestion link that will help us craft the training webinars that are important for you. And always stay connected to our community site. We have updates from the webinar team as well as our CSMs about the upcoming training webinars and Ask a Fluxpert. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us on a Friday. We hope to host you again, and I hope you guys enjoy your weekend and the rest of your workday. Take care, everybody.